Okay, here's another one that shows a few oddities here, but it has to be mentioned because it has a strangeness to it whenever you find out that there are multiple countries and areas of people that actually had a belief that heaven was somehow at the North Pole. It was like this nirvana idea or whatever, if you will, from different cultures, where they had this idea that that's where it was going to be, this Shangri-La. In fact, recently I talked about how in the people looking into the Ramayana and the Indian epics, how they said it came from the Arctic Circle or someplace. And it's not just one people that are saying this or whatever, but it has been multiple people over time stating this same effect, whether it's the Hindus or the people of India, the people in China and Japan, or even ancient people that we know of in the Nordic race or whatever, as it's shown in the top left. Such as Indian folklore, that they said there was this place named Meru. And in this concept of Meru, there is an idea of the way the world worked, if you're looking at it here, was that it was surrounded by a snake, much like a Jorgenmander idea, but then the snake also rode over top, where it was grabbing its own tail and holding us in a bubble that was the world, but there's only half the world there. The other half is too much of an angle, everybody'd fall off, of course, right? But then it goes down to elephants standing on the back. So it's the strongest creatures that they know holding up the world like Atlas. And then that concept, it's standing on a giant dragon turtle. When someone asked them, what's the turtle standing on? They eventually came up with the answer, well, it's just turtles all the way down. So someone asked, down to what? We're still waiting for a correct answer on that. But in this Buddhist Hindu belief, there's this concept where there's this pole star. And in that idea of a pole star, that's where the center of the earth, not the universe, would actually be, right? So it's strange that it's the North Pole. But then again, us in the Western Hemisphere probably could understand that a little bit with the way that it stands. And they say that there was one day and a night in the time of regular human beings was accelerated there. And we think about Santa Claus and the elves and how they were able to work versus time in situations that have came out of this concept at the North Pole again. But this was actually taken from the idea that there are places so high in the Arctic Circle that you actually get 6 months of daylight and then 6 months of night in an entire year. So it seems like a day lasts a year. You follow me? Pretty cool and unique to end up figuring these things out. But it was also seen in quite a few different places, like Zoroastrian religions and so on. And they said that the ancient Aryans had actually come from an Arctic Circle or the North Pole or some place dedicated to this star that's our pole star that we have today, the North Star. And then it had something to do with them under that. You also see in that bottom depiction here of the Behistun inscription, this is where he says that he is King Darius, King of Kings, an Aryan by Aryan race, over the Persians that are there at that time. But you see that winged sun disk that's there, that's also shown in the Sumerians, that's also shown in the Egyptians. Sure, there's some variation on a theme, but let's get rational here. That shows connectives in itself. But these ancient Aryans had this belief that they came from someplace right up near the ice, and that there was this incredibly bad thing that happened, and then because of that, they spread down and southern into a world. and we look at the idea of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the Scythians and how far we know the continental ice shelf realized down, and it's like, yeah, at some times they were probably within sight of glaciers. And whenever this Younger Dryas event thing happened that took out all the animals, it took a lot of those people out too. But they had a mythology that came from that idea. And it really wasn't the North Pole then, was it? It was more of the Arctic Circle idea. But those people also talk about these halos in the sky and situations like that. And we're like, what are you talking about? You're seeing UFOs? No, that's the Northern Lights. It's the Northern Lights. And so they have a connection to something that goes way up to there. So it's crazy. People talk about Antarctica all the time and so on like that. But this looks like it has some truth in it, with this idea of people, even though we think of as the Persians, the Egyptians, and so on, having come from an area up near the ice. Which right where that pin is that says Europe above my sign, everything up here was all covered in ice. All covered in ice. Except for conspicuously a corner here of Kamchatka in the area where mammoths were allowed to live, and a few of these little islands are off of here. But then just above that over here, there are mammoths that have been caught in an ice storm that was so cold that they were eating food at the time that this happened, knocking and breaking their legs, and then apparently flash freezing them within moments. And they're still stuck to that point today, still chewing on food, digesting it. It wasn't like this was known or going to happen even to them. Whenever it washed over them, it hit them like they never knew that it was going on. But again, this all connects to a real far north situation, and I find it strange that the people of India have that. But when you realize the Mahabharata and all the things that go with that are brought to them by the Aryans, along with horses, domesticated cattle, and everything else, maybe you'll get the idea that, yeah, they're talking about that. And they're not talking about the Himalayas that are covered with ice right here, but much more farther north, which has different weather going on now than it did at the time in question. But this is looked at as being a common remembrance that people have built into their thing. Even in China, even in Japan, they have this concept that this pole star is where heaven's at. It's why they tried to look for the sacred holy place up on the top of a mountain, because it at least had ice, so that's what we're talking about. So they went to check up there. They did find a Shangri-La type of area that's up in the Himalayas that I did a video on a couple of years ago, which shows you something that looks like a Celtic graveyard somehow, with these horse effigies and stuff on it. What am I looking at here? And you find out you're way up in a mountain inside of a little bowl area that stayed warm, covered around by stuff, and it's like, oh, this is like a sanctuary place. Maybe this is what they were talking about. But as these mythologies got spread by Proto-Europeans in different places, other people had these same concepts too. And I'm sure some of it went along with things that they might have already had going on. That's why Christianity works so well, is all these little pagan motifs that are on there connected with it, right? So, something that is easily seen is that they show you this idea, and then they'll try to tell you that the ancient Greeks and everything had this idea of Hyperboria. And it was right there at the top. Where did they get that idea from? Well, all these are ideas passed down on mythology, and then people expounded upon them, of course. So you do get some variations on a theme. The strangeness is not the variation on the theme. The strangeness is the connection. And this idea in Hyperborea, where they said that the sun was up 24 hours a day, doesn't make any sense to anybody unless you go to the Arctic Circle and up above and you'll get to a point there where the sun really never goes down. It may look like it's reaching evening and it just hangs there and comes back up. It never really goes down. And so you do have a 24-hour day in this same place, which if you're not quite as far up, you end up with a year in a day, like we talked about on 6 months of daylight, 6 months of night. Pretty crazy, but that's inside the Arctic Circle that's shown there. Even the Celts, in their ancient ways, said that heaven was someplace like the very Arctic Circle that was there, that they somehow had a longing for that idea. You'll find that people still lived up in an area that's just a little bit too cold to grow as many months as they should be able to, but they're still able to prosper, and they're still utilizing this area, such as Norway and Denmark and places like that. They get ice trapped for almost half a year, it seems. Their spring comes real late, their fall comes early, their winter comes early, but they don't have a problem with it. So a lot of these different people had this concept, and again, we have a 6 months of winter and 6 months of daylight, and when we're looking at this concept, we have to be talking about close to or above the Arctic Circle idea. And strangely, most of the cultures that we get this from are pretty far away from an Arctic Circle concept, aren't they? It's a lot closer to an equatorial type concept. But we can still see it. It's still there. Let me know what you think down below. Peace.